Today, I want to talk about the Russian Revolution, and so I want to do just a couple things at the beginning, and then I'm going to, and I hope you weren't in Jay's class, The Age of Total War, last year, because I gave almost the same lecture in it. In fact, I might have done it this year too, because, as you know, I have him come in and then he has me go into theirs. But what I want to do is see the revolution through the eyes of Nicholas and Alexandra for the last part. But first, just a couple things at the beginning, picking up on something that I said when we talked about 1848, but the Russian Revolution is a perfect way to see revolution as process at work. Because, the revolution in February, I mean, read the chapter, the revolution in February, as I said before, people wake up and there are not a lot of troops around and people are hungry and the revolution falls. I mean, I'll talk more about this in a minute. The autocracy falls rather quickly and rather easily. And it's at that point, when you've got the provisional government of Kerensky, it's at that point that, as in 1848 and as in 1789 and following years, that people who want to shape the future of the country put in their claims. And so that's when social and political conflict increase dramatically. In the context of the wars, of course, I'm just mind-boggling, with the front not all that far away from Petrograd, because St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd at the beginning of the war because it was a more Russian name. And so those groups, like the Mensheviks, whom you read about, the Bolsheviks, who Lenin comes back on the sealed train, the liberals, the cadets, the liberals, and those people who want a Tsarist restoration, and the socialist revolutionaries, of which Kerensky was one, who have the most influence in Russia of any dissident party by far. And they would be allies, especially the left wing of the socialist revolutionaries, of the Bolsheviks after the Bolshevik seizure of power. And then, of course, they're just dismissed and persecuted like the others. But they all put forward their claims, and so all of the kinds of tensions and the Kornilov, in quotes, plot, which you can read about, and the July days and all of that, really reflect the revolutionary process. And of course, what happens in October is the Bolsheviks, after one attempt that didn't work, the Bolsheviks are able to seize power. And so Trotsky, who ends up, as you know, with an ice pick planted through his neck in a garden in Mexico City, assassinated on the orders of Stalin, and Lenin and the very young Stalin, who is in jail. I mean, he's in Siberia at the time of the February Revolution. The Bolsheviks come to power, and the Soviet Union is created. And next week I'll talk about Stalin and Stalinism, but today it's enough to talk about the Russian Revolution. And so before I go back and tell you about Alexandra and about Nicholas and Alexandra and the crazed Rasputin and those folks. It is nobody expected there to be a revolution, that the Marxist revolution or version would come to Russia. That populists, who in the middle decades of the 19th century believed that the Russian peasantry was a potentially revolutionary force. I mean, people like Bakunin, whom I've talked about before. They thought that the peasants would rise up one day and sweep away their masters, to whom they were indentured as serfs until 1861. Now, that's not that long before World War I and all of that. But for Marx, I mean, the revolution had to come where you had a class-conscious proletariat that had been organized by this revolutionary elite, sort of a top-down organized revolutionary elite. And then that would come in Germany, in Britain, in France, eventually maybe in the United States. And, after the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin is still convinced that the revolution is going to come in Germany. In fact, the Spartacists do rise. They were a real far-left revolutionary group, full of some very good people, incidentally, like Rosa Luxemburg, who ends up being murdered, who was born in Zamość in what then was Russian Poland. The revolution had to come where you had an industrial proletariat, but it doesn't, or does it? So let me just, I'm a little ambiguous there, but let me say that because the revolution starts in Petrograd, that the way Petrograd was in 1917, an administrative Tsarist autocratic capital constructed by Peter the Great, but it's also a huge, enormous industrial center with hundreds of thousands of industrial workers. And the historians still debate whether by October, that is after February, during the provisional government time, the socialist revolutionaries or the Bolsheviks had more influence in the Soviet. That's where the Soviet Union comes from, in the Soviet, which were organizations of workers, sailors, and soldiers. I mean, was Marx wasn't all wrong because the revolution, the role of industrial workers in St. Petersburg is very important in this. And of course, lots of them get betrayed. I mean, they all get betrayed ultimately, because what was going to be, the workers' paradise, it ain't that. And workers' self-management, it didn't become that. Didn't become that at all. And they're shocked when the Red Guards are putting down their strikes. But in the beginning, the role of the workers on the periphery, remember, center and periphery, is terribly important. And I talk a little bit about this in what you're reading, but along the Nevsky Prospect, you have government buildings. You've got the Singer Sewing Machine Company. You've got tramways. I haven't been to St. Petersburg since Automne de Camarades, since the fall. But I mean, but very fancy stores in 1917. Very dolled up people, very rich people, and then the tramway simply stopped in the mud when they reached the periphery, when they reached the working class suburbs. And the lights, the glittering lights of the big department stores that would make you think of London and Paris and Berlin and Vienna, and the big fancy hotels, and all lit up with the doormen clicking their heels as the well-heeled enter and leave, even during the war. The lights, there weren't any lights when you got, or very few, when you got into the working class suburbs. So the one thing to keep in mind is that the Russian Revolution, both that of February and that of October, was a popular revolution. This was no sort of coup d'etat, carried out by a couple extremely organized, determined, politicos. And Lenin, he was organized and he was determined. Lenin was not what the French would call rigolo. He was not a barrel of laughs. He was sure of himself. He had very little sense of humor. He had sarcasm, biting sarcasm. And I guess I quote once in there, he said, when he would argue with somebody, he said, he who does not understand that understands nothing. He was very, very sure of himself, very difficult man to get along with. And to leave it to you to think, was Stalinism inevitable in Leninism? I'm not so sure it was, but anyway. But the revolution was a popular revolution. I mean, the fall of the autocracy, the masses did not rise up to save the Tsar. They did not, in the Tsarina. And bread, land, and peace. Bread, land, and peace is a very, very important slogan. When you've got millions of people under arms from all of the nationalities, some of whom didn't know Russian at all, many of whom, when they go into the war, don't know the difference between a gun and a pitchfork. And until the very end, Nicholas and Alexandra, who are not very lovable people, one can feel sorry for them, and you will feel sorry for them, they end horribly. But there was this sort of, they still had the belief that the Russian people loved their Tsar and that they would pour forward to save the Tsar and the Tsarina and the autocracy. And they didn't. And the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, March 1918, pulls Russia out of the war and all that. So that's just a couple things at the beginning to say, and it's all in the book, but it's, you know, it's a very interesting revolution. There's a lot of great literature on the Russian Revolution in English, and I don't read Russian at all, but in all sorts of languages. So now, having just sort of set that up, reserved seating, VIP. What is this? This is, I don't know. Anyway, there's nobody there. So anyway, let's talk about. Did I do all that? Yeah. Let's talk about Nicholas and Alexandra. Voilà. The Tsar. Nicholas was a family guy. He enjoyed his family. They played tennis. They were modern people. They had bicycles. They pedaled around. The bicycle was relatively, recent invention, as you know. The first big bicycle races in Europe are already in the 1890s. But like his cousin, Nicholas II, he had some general education in the political economy and math and geography, in foreign languages, which he spoke very well, and in military science, but he had very little intellectual interest at all. And built into the way he looked at the world was this inherent suspicion of rationality, of the Enlightenment. He was somebody who, and his wife also, would still blame, if he discussed it, Peter the Great for having really incorporated in some ways rational organization and the Enlightenment, at least the works of the philosophe, into Russia long before that. He believed that waging war was a matter of honor, and in that he shared lots with his wacko cousin Wilhelm II. He was hardworking. In the sense that he read or listened to reports on all that was going on about the war. Mark Steinberg has published some of the letters of Mark Steinberg is a friend of mine who teaches at Illinois, and if I remember correctly, the Tsar believed that the nobles had compromised the fate of the autocracy in some ways, or threatened it by being indolent and not working hard enough. His view was always that he was the father of his people, that he was the holy Tsar. And again, everybody's seen pictures of him sitting on a horse, blessing the kneeling soldiers as they're going off to fight in 1914. He constantly referred to his ancestors, the Romanovs. Only the state which preserves the heritage of the past is strong and firm, he wrote. We ourselves have sinned against this, and God is punishing us with the war. He took command of the Russian army in 1915 against the advice of his wife. He didn't usually go against the advice of Alexandra, the advice of his ministers, and the advice of the mad monk, Rasputin. Obviously, one of the reasons that people argued against this was A, he really wasn't a military guy, and B, if it doesn't go well, will people blame the Tsar? Will the role of the Tsar be diminished? He had a strong sense of what he considered moral, and it was shaped by his Orthodox religion. His wife, about whom I'll have more to say, was a convert to Russian Orthodoxy, and like many converts from one religion to another, was absolutely fanatic in her attachment. He was more relaxed about religion than his wife was, but he often spoke about the sort of ecstasy, religious ecstasy that he felt when he went to church. You know, historians now say, well, it's too easy to shape a discourse about the Russian Revolution around the influence of Rasputin. But in fact, Rasputin in 1914 had warned that war would bring God's punishment upon Russia and great destruction and grief without end. And, you know, Rasputin did have great influence with the family. In one letter, again, this is Mark put this stuff together, he wrote, the Tsar wrote, "When I am worried or doubtful or vexed, I have only talked to Gregory for a few minutes to feel myself immediately soothed and strengthened." Now, one of the reasons that Rasputin had so much influence on the royal family was, of course, tragic illness. Because Alexei, the son, was a hemophiliac. And hemophiliacs, I guess now they can treat it easier than they could before, but when hemophiliacs get a scratch, they can bleed, the blood does not coagulate, and you know, they can die. And so he was always sort of, he was not in good health at all. And Rasputin, on a couple of occasions, got lucky and predicted the end of a spell, as they used to call them, or an episode of hemophilia, and everything worked out okay. And so this increases the belief of these parents in the power, if you will, of Rasputin. And when there was a mutiny in the Navy, he wrote, "If you find me so little troubled, it is because I have the firm and absolute faith that the destiny of Russia, of my own fate and that of my family, are in the hands of Almighty God, who has placed me where I am. Whatever may happen, I shall bow to his will." And this kind of fatalism you would see to the end. When after the revolution he's on a train, you know, he doesn't. He finally has to turn back, but he doesn't. This is sort of fatalism was part of it, and maybe Rasputin by then that point was already dead. He'd been assassinated, and even the story of his assassination, I mean, it was almost impossible to kill him. They kept hammering him with huge rocks and pumping one bullet after another into him. The people that wanted to get him out of the way, and they finally, after just sort of beating the hell out of him and pumping one bullet after another into all parts of his body, they threw him into a lake weighted down with rocks. And when they brought the body up and did an autopsy, they found out that he died of drowning. But anyway, his influence over the Tsar in a way helped accentuated this sort of fatalism that was almost predetermined, you could say, by his religious orthodoxy. But if you're going to be the autocratic czar, father of all the people, you don't want any political institution that's going to limit your will. Now, the Duma, the assembly, had been created in 1905 after the revolution, which I trust that you have read about in 1905, and the role of the Russo-Japanese War in facilitating that. He believed that even the existence of the Duma would compromise the virtues of autocracy. And as you know, the Duma loses most of what authority it had given. That the Duma seemed to be a rational organization, and this didn't fit terribly well in a worldview that believes in faith, feeling as opposed to reason, and has a particular and sometimes peculiar idea of morality shaped by the traditions of Mother Russia. And he and his wife look back to this sort of imaginary time before Peter the Great, when the true Russia did not look westward at all and was not tempted by these foreign imports. And he idealized that time of piety, the unity between the Tsar and his people, the Narod. In 1902, he wrote a letter to Alexandra when he was on tour. He said, "We passed through large villages where the good peasants presented simple bread and salt," which is very important in Russia. And at his coronation, they spilled the salt that was part of the ceremony. And that was a bad omen. He was very superstitious, by the way. 17 was his unlucky number. He was terrified of 17. And there was a huge throng at his inauguration and a stampede, and lots of people were killed. So that was a bad omen too. But anyway, he said, all the peasants presented simple bread and salt, and all went down immediately on their knees, showing such a touching childish joy. He had the image that the Russian people were childish, that they, and his wife insisted on this, that they loved being whipped. They loved being punished. Now, since the abolition of the serfdom in 1861, there was lots of mistreatment of peasants by lords, but you could no longer torture, literally torture, a serf so long as he didn't die. And before 1861, if you tortured a serf and he did die, or if you just exited him, ordered him killed, or killed him yourself, you would receive a small fine. But still, there was this idea that the narod, that the people of good, quote unquote, good, virtuous, and kindly, will come to their senses, and that they will not disobey during the war. They will do what he told them. And until the end, possibly, we don't know this, the idea that they will rise up and take him away from his captors in those final days. And they did try. There were attempts, but it wasn't ordinary people. So he had these views of orthodoxy, autocracy, aristocracy, etc. It's a romantic view. He preferred Russian foods. Peter the Great liked Russian food, but he also, remember, ripped roasts off tables in London and drank tons of wine and things like that when he was in Western Europe. He spoke Russian, obviously, very well, but he spoke English with his wife because English was her language, along with some German, and again. Speaking English was part of the kind of aristocratic tradition of speaking other languages by the aristocracy, but not Russian, because again, French and German was, they did speak Russian, but French and German were sort of privileged languages. And he had his feeling that he didn't like big cities. He had his retreat on the sea near St. Petersburg or Petrograd. He said that Moscow and St. Petersburg were two needle dots on the map of our country. Well, in terms of percentages, he was certainly correct. And it was his idea to rename St. Petersburg Petrograd because it was more Russian. But he believed that, and I've already spoken about this a little bit, that the heart of the empire was Moscow because it was the religious capital of the empire, and that the skyline was dotted with churches and not by government buildings. That part of having a modern army and a modern navy was you had to have a bureaucracy, and that Petrograd was a bureaucratized city and not truly Russian in its heart and in its spirit. And he didn't spend much time in the famous Winter Palace. That of the siege in the Russian Revolution, and when he moved to his when he went to his provincial resort on the sea, where I've been, but a long time ago, he had a new church built there, but in the Moscow style, in the original Moscow style. Now, Nicholas and Alexandra, were raving anti-Semites. And that's why it's amazing, this business about, I don't know if didn't they canonize him as a saint or something? I really don't know, but that's horrific. He loved the Black Hundreds who had sparked in the pogrom, particularly in Crimea in 1905, and had beaten Jews to death. He thought that they represented the true heart of Russia. His interpretation was that the pogrom were the pious rage. I think that's Mark's phrase, but not his. But again, here's his, against, and I unfortunately quote, the Poles and the Yids, that is a slang, horrible, racist ethnic denunciation of people who happen to be Jewish, who had agitated and brought about the concessions of 1905. That the revolution of 1905, and until he went to his grave, so to speak, he believed that the Russian Revolution was the work of Jews. Now, incidentally, because some of the Bolsheviks, a fair number of the Bolsheviks happened to be Jewish, this played in the Russian Civil War because of the sheer brutality in the Russian Civil War of the quote-unquote white forces against the Reds or the Bolsheviks was often part of just sort of extension of anti-Semitism run wild. Anyway, Nicholas wrote that the deaths of these people, of the Jews in 1905, was justified. Quote, harm befell not only the Yids, but also Russian agitators, engineers, lawyers, and all other bad people. Well, anyway, it's very sad, but there's lots of complexity built into his being. On one hand, he's supposed to be the czar of all the people. He's supposed to be ruthless. He's supposed to be tough, hard, etc., etc. But on the other hand, he's dominated by his wife, and his wife is constantly urging him in her letters to him to be harsh. Demonstrate, quote, the power of your will and your decisiveness. Show you're the complete autocrat without whom, quote, Russia cannot exist. Ah, my love, when at last will you thump with your hand upon the table and scream at those who act wrongly? They do not fear you enough, but indeed they must. Oh, my boy, make one tremble before you. To love you is not enough. They must obey you. Show to all that you are the master, and that your will be obeyed. He signed one letter to his wife, quote, ever your poor little hussy, that's an odd choice of word, with a tiny will. With a tiny will. She was born in Germany, a princess. And these royals, as I've stressed, they're all intermarried. She's the granddaughter of Queen Victoria of England. She had identity with Hesse-Darmstadt, the part of Germany in which she was born. And as I said, although she spoke English at home and with her children, she had been a convert to Russian Orthodoxy. She also feared or resented idleness. She thought it was important to work. She was a nurse for her children. She worked for her son above all. She worked very, very hard. She wanted to keep her daughters, quote, from foolish gossip and away from being, quote, idle and listless. She was fanatically religious. She went to church every day, and she was intolerant of those people who did not. And again, this turns them toward Rasputin. Now, again, Rasputin did not make by being who he was, the Russian Revolution. It's a popular revolution, but still, he's there lurking in the shadows. She said, God has given Rasputin more insight, wisdom, and enlightenment than all of the Tsar's advisors. And at home, she reinforces the ideas that any kind of compromise, constitutional compromise, was dangerous. And she believed that until the end that St. Petersburg, Petrograd, was a rotten town, not Russian at all. And as for the Black Hundreds, who had murdered all the Jews, they represented, quote, the healthy, right-thinking Russians. The Russian people loved to be whipped, she said. That was a quote. She believed it was in the Slavic nature. And they use over and over the word childish in describing the Russian people. The progressive bloc which I sent around on the website. She believed that the existence of the progressive bloc, which wouldn't have been really possible had it not been for World War I. That's one way. World War I gives opportunity to Russian dissidents to get together in ways that they couldn't have otherwise. It makes possible the creation and operation of voluntary associations that are bringing people together to try to send food and letters to the front, to get news from the front that are not military secrets. And these inevitably began to imagine a world without the Tsar. And there were people in 1905 who could imagine a world without the Tsar. But again, there are lots of people who are thinking about the post-war world and who imagine or are beginning to plan for a reformed Tsarism. It's very hard to say how many people could comprehend the idea that Russia would not have a Tsar. Obviously, the Mensheviks, the Socialist Revolutionaries, and the Bolsheviks did feel that way. But all of these dissident groups want change. But only the liberals, and particularly the cadets, K-A-D-E-T-S, whom you can read about, want the Tsardom, the autocracy, to continue. But until the very end, Nicholas is determined to defend the autocracy, trying to transfer power to his brother when the revolutionary comes, Michael, who would be the regent for Alexei. And then when told by his son's physician, and imagine this, that his son would not recover, he tried to leave the autocracy in the hands forever of his brother Michael, but in fact he abdicated the next day, and he really wrote only, "All around me is treachery, cowardice, and deceit." Now, what were they going to do with him? What do you do with the Tsar of all the Russians and Alexandra and their children? Now, predictably enough, the liberals and the cadets want to have them protected. The socialists basically want him to go on trial. That is, the Mensheviks, the Socialist Revolutionaries, and the Bolsheviks. But for a couple of days, they don't do anything at all. I mean, they've got other things going on. They've got the war, and I won't discuss the attitude of the provisional government to the war and the kinds of pressures from the Allies, of course, for them to keep the war going, and that is handled in textbooks, in the textbook. But there are more demands from the public and from the Soviets, in particular, to arrest him. And so the provisional government want to protect them, and they finally order them confined to the resort, which is called Tsarskoe Selo, but the name doesn't matter. Nicholas himself, he wants to go to Britain. And one day he wanted to live out the rest of his life with his family in Crimea. Now, does the British government want the Tsar of all the Russian people to arrive in London? Not exactly, because it might complicate the war effort. And the Labour will have no part of it at all. And because you're dealing with a coalition in the war, you can't have the Tsar, you're not going to be coming in a 747 or something, but you can't have him coming up the river in the Thames. And how are you going to get him there in the first place? So that simply is not practical. And the liberals didn't want the Tsar there either. But there were constantly rumors that the Tsar was going to be allowed to leave, and there's lots of protests about that. Kerensky says that the revolution should show its moral worth by seeing that no harm came to the royal family. By the way, just as an aside, Kerensky lived a very, very long life. And at the end of his life, he taught this course at Stanford University. And there's a story that's probably apocryphal, that a student once, this was in very contentious times in American politics in the late 1960s. I can vaguely remember those days. And that a student, not realizing it was Kerensky, asked a question sort of saying, how could the provisional government be so stupid in their conduct of those operations. And the clueless person, they had no idea that this was Kerensky, who was an historian and was trained as an historian, and he died shortly thereafter. But that is really it's an amazing thing. Of course, Lenin dies in 1924 or 25, but Kerensky went on and on. So what they do, they're in the park. I mean, they're in the resort. Their little palace there, mini palace. They're allowed to take walks. They could talk on the telephone, but only in Russian. And only in the presence of a guard who spoke Russian. They could not speak German, or they could not speak English. They separated the family for a while, fearful of the influence of Alexandra on Nicholas. Now again, this is rather like the attitude that people had toward Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI, because people thought that the influence of Marie Antoinette was prénom, that it was overwhelming on Louis XVI. Anyway, then they were put back together, and they didn't have much to do. They gardened, they taught the children, which they always had done. They wrote letters, they went to church. And they complained that the soldiers were more and more disrespectful. They were noisy. They were slovenly in their dress. Their crushed caps were set awry on huge mops of unkept hair. Their coats were half-buttoned, and their nonchalant manner of performing their military duties was a constant irritation. And they mocked them. They'd knock on the door. Who's there? And the answer, who is there? And the answer would come, the Tsar of all the Russians. And a Latvian guard, a mere commoner, in quotes, outside would be laughing uproariously. Once he was pedaling, the Tsar was pedaling his bike, and he goes by a guard who has a bayonet, and the guy sticks his bayonet into the spokes of the wheel, and the Tsar of all the Russians went tumbling down and skinned his knees. But yet there were rumors how well they were eating when nobody else was eating. When the July days mini attempted revolution comes, for their own safety, Kerensky says they have to be moved, and so they decide on Siberia, almost inevitably, to a town called Tobolsk, where they would presumably be safe, and they were moved on August 1st, 1917, with their windows covered up for most of the trip. Like Lenin, when he comes back, is brought back by Germany to help to encourage the Russians to get out of the war, he goes on the famous sealed train. So people can't see that it is Lenin, because people knew what he looked like. The same thing, the Tsar of all the people are not going to be seen by the masses, because what if they try to stop the train and pull him off that? Ironically, they passed by Rasputin's home village, and indeed his house, as a steamboat took them via two rivers to this town of Tobolsk, where I have never been. This frightened them, because especially Nicholas is so superstitious. The salt falling, the stampede, the number 17, and all of this, is that when they're pulled by the house or on the steamboat of the dead Rasputin, his trusted advisor, it is a bad omen. And so they could go to church when they arrived. They play cards, they perform plays, en famille, which they did a lot. But as the counter-revolution was a very real threat, of course, and of course the Americans and the British and the French after the Bolshevik Revolution. If you want, one reason that Stalin was so paranoid, I mean, he's clinically paranoid, just a complete dangerous crackpot, but they had a lot to be paranoid about, because the Americans and the British and the French kept trying to, undo the Russian Revolution. But anyway, they were photographed, and they had ID cards. I mean, you can imagine the Tsar and the Tsarina having ID cards, like your Yale ID cards, they start seeing obscene graffiti written. New guards come in that were thought to be had even less respect for him than the other people. There are serious attempts to kidnap them and to take them, to get rid of them. There was one in which monarchists were supposed to be hidden under the altar of, or Tsarist, under the altar of the church, when they're in the service. And this, again, these throwback to the revolution. It was like in French Revolution, there's a massacre starts at the festival of the Federation. when people are hidden under the church. And so there are articles in the newspapers calling for the surveillance of Nicholas the Bloody Romanov, and calls for him to be put on trial. The arrival of a certain Vasily Yakovlev, the name you don't have to remember obviously, sent by the Central Executive Committee of the Soviets. He was a longtime revolutionary, rumored subsequently to have been an agent of the Germans, which is preposterous. I mean, Lenin was rumored to have been an agent of the Germans by his enemies because of the way he got back to Russia after the initial revolutions. He was the son of a peasant. He had that kind of curriculum vitae that lots of folks, including Stalin, had. He had participated in holdups, armed holdups to raise money for revolution, and became a Bolshevik. He transferred the Tsar and family to a much smaller place. The Tsar and his wife believed naively that they were going to be taken to Moscow because Kerensky wanted, because the provisional government wanted, originally, before the provisional government is ended, wants Nicholas to sign the eventual peace treaty with the Germans. This Yakovlev was ordered to take his baggage, as they called it, that is the royal family, to this small town in the Urals, in the Ural Mountains. But the Ural Mountain Bolsheviks were harder to control. Remember, the Russian Revolution, both the first one and the second, have been aptly described as a revolution by telegraph. I mean, the vast reaches of the Russian Empire so absolutely enormous that in many cases it was weeks, in a few places months, before any revolutionary commissar arrived to sort of inform people what's going on. And so lots of these Bolsheviks were sort of freelancers, and for a party that was extremely hierarchically controlled from the top down, there was very little control over the Ural Bolsheviks. Nicholas had some trepidation about that because he heard that there was a quote, wrote that there was a mood that was rather harsh against him. Conditions were worse. They used to like to photograph birds and things like that in bushes. Their equipment was taken away from them. They could no longer control their own money. The guards couldn't talk to them at all, so they could only talk to each other. And some of the guards were just awful to them. There were plans afoot to put them on trial, a kind of show trial, but there was also the distinct possibility discussed that they might simply be killed. Trotsky asked that they be put on trial so that the corruption and abuses of the autocracy could be revealed. The context is that there are, large, massive armies being organized, the white armies, and because foreign intervention was already underway, it's conceivable that, one could imagine why there was a current, national current within the Bolsheviks, but local in particular, and that's what would count, that they should be executed. It's possible that a telegram came from Moscow ordering that they be executed, or simply that it was the Ural Bolsheviks, Ural Mountains, U-R-A-L, Bolsheviks acting on their own. Recently, the archives have been opened up only in the last 10 or 15 years, and the people that have looked think that that is mostly the case. In any case, the order came that in July 1918 that there be a trial, but if that was not possible, deemed possible, that they should be shot. A bloody execution in the night of early morning, really, of July 16th, 17th. That number again. They actually died on the 17th of July 1918 in a horrific massacre with machine guns and pistols, a bloodbath in the basement of a house. Almost immediately, there were stories that Alexandra and her daughters had been seen taking a train away from there. Way into the 1980s, the Russian community in Paris tended to settle around the Boulevard Montparnasse, where there's still a very good Russian restaurant that is there. And there's a particular cafe called the Coupole, where sort of the Russian emigre, wealthy people went. And there were periodically women turning up who claimed to be the daughter, and then later, as the time passed, the granddaughter of the Tsar. It was only after what was left of the bodies, or the bones, them dry bones, were discovered in 1976, and forensic experts in 1991 were able to work with the DNA, that the victims have all been accounted for. None of them escaped. And the others were in that long Russian tradition of false czars or false tsarinas, the loyalty of to whom in the 18th century generated so many uprisings. What can one say? You know, he's being canonized, this vicious, murderous anti-Semite, by the Russian Orthodox Church. But that's not my church. It's not for me to say that. So I don't know. Yes, I do know. But anyway, tragic martyrdom, you know, were they, you know, heroic people or simply human beings who were mowed down in a revolution that didn't start out as a bloody revolution, but became a very, very bloody civil war. Was it the first signpost of Soviet totalitarianism? No, it wasn't that. Was it bloody vengeance for past misdeeds in the pursuit of justice? It depends on your viewpoint. I happen to believe the latter. See you on Wednesday. Thank you. Next week I'll talk about Stalin and Stalinism. But today it's enough to talk about the Russian Revolution. And so before I go back and tell you about Alexandra and about Nicholas and Alexandra and the crazed Rasputin and those folks, you know, it is a, you know, nobody expected there to be a revolution, that the Marxist revolution or version would come to Russia. That populists who in the middle decades of the 19th century believed that the Russian peasantry was a potentially revolutionary force. I mean, people like Bakunin, whom I've talked about before. You know, they thought that the peasants would rise up one day and sweep away their masters to whom they were indentured as serfs until 1861. Now that's not that long before falls rather quickly and rather easily. And it's at that point, when you've got the provisional government of Kerensky, it's at that point that, as in 1848 and as in 1789 and following years, that people who want to shape the future of the country put in their claims. And so that's when social and political conflict increase dramatically. In the context of the wars, of course, I'm just mind-boggling, with the front not all that far away from Petrograd, because St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd at the beginning of the war because it was more a more Russian name. And so those groups like the Mensheviks, whom you read about, the Bolsheviks, who you know, Lenin comes back on the sealed train, the liberals, the cadets, the liberals, and those people who wanted a Tsarist restoration, and the socialist revolutionaries, of which Kerensky was one, who have the most influence in Russia of any dissident party by far. And they would be allies, especially the left wing of the socialist revolutionaries, of the Bolsheviks after the Bolshevik seizure of power. And then, of course, they're just dismissed and you know, persecuted like the others. But they all put forward their claims, and so all of the kinds of tensions and the Kornilov, in quotes, plot, which you can read about, and the July days and all of that, really reflect the revolutionary process. And of course, what happens in October is the Bolsheviks After one attempt that didn't work, the Bolsheviks are able to seize power. And so Trotsky, who ends up, as you know, with an ice pick planted through his neck in a garden in Mexico City, assassinated on the orders of Stalin, and Lenin and the very young Stalin, who is in jail. I mean, he's in Siberia at the time of the February Revolution. The Bolsheviks come to power, and the Soviet Union is created, and before World War I and all of that. But for Marx, I mean, the revolution had to come where you had a class-conscious proletariat that had been organized by this revolutionary elite, sort of a top-down organized revolutionary elite, and then that would come in Germany, in Britain, in France, eventually maybe in the United States. And after the Bolshevik Revolution, Lenin is still convinced that the revolution is going to come in Germany. In fact, the Spartacists do rise. They were a real far-left revolutionary group, full of some very good people, incidentally, like Rosa Luxemburg, who ends up being murdered, who was born in Zamość in what then was Russian Poland. The revolution had to come where you had an industrial proletariat. But it doesn't, or does it? So let me just, I'm a little ambiguous. Today I want to talk about the Russian Revolution, and so I want to do just a couple things at the beginning, and then I'm going to, and I hope you weren't in Jay's class, The Age of Total War, last year, because I gave almost the same lecture in it. In fact, I might have done it this year too, because as you know, I have him come in and then he has me go into theirs. But what I want to do is see the revolution through the eyes of Nicholas and Alexandra for the last part. But first, just a couple things at the beginning, picking up on something that I said when we talked about 1848, but the Russian Revolution is a perfect way to see revolution as process at work. Because, the revolution in February, I mean, read the chapter, the revolution in February, as I said before, people wake up and there are not a lot of troops around and people are hungry and the revolution falls. I mean, I don't talk more about this in a minute, the autocracy